Welcome to the Criminology Forum. We are happy to have here with us one of our own alum, Chris Schreck. He has gone on to do wonderful things since he has learned all the wonderful things he learned here at Penn State. He's currently in Rochester. He focuses mainly on victimization and the victim-offender overlap. He has a recent piece in the annual review of criminology on that. He's recently won the Smith Award from ACJS for his work. And today he's going to kind of overlap his work with also where theory is going in the field and how we build newer theories moving forward. Am I correct?
Yep.
So I think this is going to be an exciting talk, especially for our graduate students and those of us trying to not just analyze data, but develop theory and test theories in the field. So I'm very happy to have you, Chris. And I'll let you finish your introductions.
I'm very happy to be here, actually. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. It's very exciting for me to be able to reconnect with old faces, but also to connect with new faces, and maybe we'll be more familiar with each other, and I'll get to know your work. And later on, how many of you guys are going to the happy hour? Yeah. Nice. So, as Megan said, my area of specialty is in crime target decision making, and I didn't start out that way. Actually, I never took a course in victimology. I'm going to tell a little bit of the story behind what led me in this direction. My training has been almost exclusively in the area of criminological theory and crime research, and my goal from the very beginning was to try to bridge victimization research and what we knew about victims and criminological theory and how they kind of like interrelate with each other and some of the theoretical opportunities that this provides us with. Megan, possibly unwisely, gave me complete freedom to choose my topic, and I had the I could have presented a standard research paper, but I figured here, since it was going to be a mixed audience of graduate students, what I wanted to do was I wanted to instead present a paper that was pivotal to me in terms of like my thinking. And it was a paper that came out in 2021 in the Advances in Criminological Theory, which was entitled "What Ideas of Victimization and Vulnerability Mean for Criminological Theory and Logical Appraisal." This represents in sort of like a, for me, I have no idea, time will tell whether it has any kind of effect on criminology, but for me, it was something pivotal, as I said, in terms of like setting my research agenda going forward and what I saw as, the possibilities for the field and ways to kind of like sift out the good theories from the bad theories. And one of the things that I wanted to do for you guys was to give you a little bit of insight into how theory works, or at least how you create theory. When I was an undergraduate, at the University of Florida, learning theories for the first time, there was a lot of information about what made a good theory and a poor theory and about the concepts, but there was like no information whatsoever about how you actually created a theory. And so to me, it was something like sorcery involved with that. Maybe there still is, right? But the question, whenever I give talks to victimology seminars or crim theory seminars for various grad programs, the question I always get from the graduate students is, how did you, as a first-year master's student, come up with the theory that basically has monopolized crime target decision-making for the past 25 years? That's a good question. I'm going to try to answer that in a way that I hope will help you guys. Normally, I would just give like the narrative and the story, but that's just simply going, recounting events isn't really helpful. I wanted to try to systematize it for you and maybe tie it into some of the things, some of the pieces of information maybe you've been exposed to in the course of your graduate studies here, and maybe help it make sense for you. Let's see. I'm going to go over my goals for today's lecture in just a moment here, but what I hope is that today's lecture will be interactive. And so, to give you a chance to participate a little bit in it and maybe, experience kind of like, how I approach doing theory. But before I begin, I want to talk about the question of victim blaming, first of all, because that's one of the unfortunate consequences of doing research in crime target decision making. And how many of you guys are familiar with the term acronym DARVO? Okay, so it's It's a acronym that means deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It's something that you encounter in research, or at least in situations involving abuse. You also see it like, if you see police officers in news murder somebody, the response is, well, the person they shot, well, they were a criminal, and so they deserve to be executed on the street side, something like that. That is kind of like what we're talking about here with respect to victim blaming. I want to be clear that there is a distinction between blame and scientific cause. And the theoretical perspective that I am approaching this talk with is that crime is a choice. Vulnerability does not give somebody the license to take advantage of that vulnerability. So I want that to be understood. Blame also means deserved. Whereas if we're looking at causes, there are no value judgments. We just accept that offenders are opportunistic, and we'll try to take advantage of the situation wherever they can. So just, again, try to understand that the purpose of this is not to assign blame. My view is that, we should be able to live our lives in whatever way we think best without having to worry about being victimized. But we face an unfortunate reality where there are people who will take advantage of a situation. I also want to be clear here too that I am like pushing the wrong keys here. That today is not about the victimization of those who are unable to exercise autonomy. So young children who are beaten and abused, the elderly, as well as people who are attacked in police custody, for example, or like in some sort of setting where either you cannot give people choice or it is not feasible to do so. What I am interested in are those situations where the potential victim can exercise some degree of autonomy and affect their risk of victimization in some non-zero way. And then also, I want to mention this too, is kind of like the flip side or the plus side of the approach that I'm taking here. Many people in criminology, and I think rightly so, are suspicious and skeptical and disenchanted with the operation of the criminal legal system. And we hear about this in the news a lot. The approach that I'm taking offers an alternative to crime control that does not rely on the criminal legal system at all. All you need to do is just simply get people to lock their doors, not update the security software and things like that. And it's worth it to understand that optimal decisions are usually not feasible, that all of us, as we go through our lives, are making choices. And sometimes we have to sacrifice security in order to, for instance, go to work, right? Right now, your houses are probably vulnerable, right? Because you made the choice to be here, which I'm grateful for, but maybe a burglar is too. Oftentimes there is no clear right choice here. And so, people are trying to manage the best they can. And so, again, this is something that points to the fact that, we can't assign blame necessarily. And then effective support for potential victims is not feasible without understanding the reality of how they make their choices. If you have a precaution that you want people to undertake and yet you make it onerous and difficult, well, we shouldn't be too surprised that people don't use it much. I mean, after all, how many of you guys, we get a warning saying you need to restart your computer, and you say, I got something to do. So you don't do it because it takes 20 minutes. That's what I'm talking about here. So with that out of the way, the goals for today. I wanted to start off by, for the benefit of the students, by talking about where does original theory come from. And in this case, it's going to be an example that's unique to my situation and how I came to the idea of connecting low self-control with victimization risk. And there's a little bit of context involved here because I think context really matters. I had not taken a victimology course, as I said. I had not yet taken a graduate theory course. And Travis Hershey, during my first semester at the University of Arizona, met with me every week, and he would assign readings. So he was tutoring me about his approach to doing theory. So the kinds of papers that we were reading weren't explications of theories. They weren't about testing theories or anything like that. They were meta papers, basically about theory and how you do it and the assumptions behind them and the history of criminological thought. So what he was trying to do was give me sort of like a grasp of the mechanisms and the assumptions underneath theories. So what ended up happening was by the time he assigned me a general theory of crime, I was sitting in my cubicle at the University of Arizona reading it, and I came across 3 sentences that basically changed my life. There they are. I looked at this, and I had never taken a course in victimology, although I had the vague sense that victimology was an extremely marginal area of study, even slightly disreputable. And I read this, and my first thought on reading it, I stopped, because first of all, it was unexpected. I did not expect that there was going to be an overlap between victims and offenders at all. I said that if they're so similar, why couldn't our theories of crime explain why people are vulnerable? Okay, if they're virtually identical in every respect. So that was the start of a new theory. It was just recognizing somewhere buried in a book and never mentioned again in that book, something that caught my attention. I sat there and thought about it for a little bit. And then, I worked out the theory in my mind, and I tried different alternatives, and self-control seemed like it worked the best. And I went from there. So, by the way, something else I should probably mention here too. If it's true that criminological theories could be extended or adapted to explain why people make decisions that leave them vulnerable, then I also realized that any theory of crime conceivably could be recast or adapted to explain why people are vulnerable. In other words, rather than just simply no theory out there, there were any number of theories that potentially could be set up to compete against one another to explain crime target behavior. If that is true, then every single study attempted looking at criminal offending as the outcome could be duplicated with victimization, and you would find the same results. And if that is true, then every single debate that we've had about crime, the age crime curve, criminal careers, longitudinal research, play out exactly the same way with victimization. So as you can imagine, I was feeling pretty grandiose at that moment. That's pretty heady stuff for a second semester master's student. I saw all these possibilities here with this. I love reading about science, and Jacob Bernowski was I guess, an earlier version of Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and so there was a lot of information in this book about science and how people came across ideas and all of that. And I wanted to ask you guys this question, see if you can maybe figure out what's going on here. Why do you suppose the question I asked, a very simple one, can criminological theory explain crime target vulnerability? Why might that question be impertinent? If you're a victimologist, you'll know the answer.
Can you repeat the question?
Why do you suppose the question I asked, can criminological theories of crime and offending behavior, explain vulnerability to crime as well? Why might that question be impertinent?
Well, I guess because the decision to commit a crime is you're choosing an action, where victimization, you don't have the choice. You're not choosing to be a victim, and so maybe the choice mechanism of offending versus.
It's very easy to come to that conclusion. And if you accept the worldview of victimology, let me give you guys an example of what I mean here. One of the leading victimology textbooks once had a chapter on theories of victimization. And these theories, in a regular crime theory textbook, you'd have classical theories, positivist theories, disorganization, human ecology, social ecology theories, and so on. This victimology textbook, which was one of the leading ones, classified theories of victimization as either victim blaming or victim affirming. So as you can imagine, had I taken a course on victimology, or for that matter, a victimologist looking at this, they would never ask the question that I'd asked, because immediately, because of their training, they would shut it down, right? So I was asking very much an impertinent question. From the perspective of crime theory, why do you suppose my question was impertinent? That should probably be easier for many of you guys to resonate with. How many of you guys actually thought about doing research on crime victims when you came into to Penn State? So a couple of you guys from the beginning.
We do have a couple.
That actually is surprising, because most people want to study crime. When I was a graduate student in the 1990s, the zeitgeist of the 1990s was theories of crime. There was a vast explosion of theories of crime. Wayne, you were part of it. And it was you know, an exciting time, but that was where you made your name, was doing research on offending. Nobody did research on victimization, or at least stayed for very long in it. And so it was basically an invisible area to people who studied criminal offending. So the point I wanted to make here was, you guys as the students, because you're not as invested in particular assumptions and modes of thought, are the best position to make the big contributions. I was 25 years old, and like I said, I was in my second semester of graduate school, and you know, I was kind of like in that sort of like transitional area where I had not bought into anything yet, and I was approaching things kind of like with a very curious and open mind. So you know, I wanted to be able to show you guys here maybe how you might make the contribution. I mean, did you guys ever hold on. Did you guys ever have the feeling that all the good ideas have been taken up by the time you started taking your first? Yeah, I felt the same way, and this was the 1990s. You know, and I wanted to hopefully show you guys here that theory is not sorcery. And you know, as I said before, you and I can work on this together. I do want to make clear that today's exercise does not mean that you agree with me. All right. All we're doing is we're starting with a logical premise and developing what it may mean. And all it requires is that you just be true to the internal logic, and that you be unafraid to go where it takes you. In other words, be prepared to ask the impertinent questions. So the idea here is that hopefully you'll find this useful. There may be an opportunity that happens in your career at some point that will completely change the trajectory of where you're going. And it may be victimization, maybe some other aspect of the crime problem. I, of course, have other goals. These are some of the goals in the ideas paper that we're going to be centering on here today. One thing that I came to realize over the course of time, and you know, from the very beginning actually, was that all theories of crime contain assumptions of human nature. And to the extent we agree that victims and offenders are both human beings, then both operate under similar rules of behavior, or at least, you know, foundational premises. Okay, they are inextricably and logically linked. It is not appropriate or valid to treat them separately. Okay, all theories of crime, therefore, since victims and offenders share the same assumptions of human nature, all of them contain an implicit idea of victimization. Starting with those assumptions of human nature, you can derive from that what victimization means. You can derive from that, you can answer the question of whether that meaning is innate or is it acquired from some other source. You can ask the question, is the ability to react to victimization or its possibility innate or acquired? In other words, when you lock your door, was it because, you know, you were watching other people on television lock their doors, something like that? Or did you kind of like see the sense of locking the door? And targets even affect offender behavior. Also, too, is an implicit idea of vulnerability, which answers the question of why do offenders prefer some targets and leave other targets alone? How does that happen? Does vulnerability exist only in the mind of the criminal, or is it an objective quality of the target that anybody could respond to or notice? And then also, too, what accounts for the behavior of potential targets and victims? Why do some engage in precautionary behavior while others do not? Or why do they make particular choices about precautionary behavior? So these are some of the questions I was trying to answer in the ideas paper. Because of these concepts, as far as like why all of this matters, you cannot have a theory of crime, and it does not matter what theory of crime you prefer. You cannot have one without an implicit theory of crime targets, and therefore this represents an opportunity, a golden opportunity for those of you who want to make your names as theorists, to look at the assumptions of your theory and try to understand what does it say about crime target behavior. The job of any theorist, as I say here, is to explicate the implicit. Also, too, and this is maybe one of the more provocative claims that I make in the ideas papers, that any theory of crime, however seemingly persuasive and well supported by the evidence, is falsified if, using the assumptions of that theory, you cannot produce a believable theory of victimization, one that is consistent with the facts. And so there are, you know, there's been a problem in criminology where, you know, we haven't been able to falsify theories. Tom Bernard, one of my own professors here, wrote a paper on that, you know, why we have falsified theories. And, you know, if anything, this represents maybe one way to attack the problem, maybe clear out some of the clutter of theories that we have in our field. Yeah, Rich.
You asked for
Yeah, go ahead.
Right.
Absolutely.
So the idea that offending is correlated with victimization, which everyone agrees, doesn't mean that it's perfectly correlated.
No.
And the variables that cause offending and victimization are the same. There may be some similar variables that cause both, but there are variables that cause one and not the other, and the strength of effects is likely to vary.
So that's actually one thing I was going to get to in just a moment, because I was going to talk about like the anomaly here. I mean, you are right. We do know, we can establish empirically that there are people who are kind of like, victims only and offenders only. The problem, however, is that the correlates that you mentioned are really unstable. Like one study that may be predictive of victims and not offending, you don't find that duplicated in other research. So you have to ask the question kind of like, is that just like some artifact of the data, or is it real? And oftentimes people don't really have like a theoretical explanation for why, this variable causes victimization only, but not offending, or vice versa. But I'll touch on that hopefully in just a moment here when I get to this. But for the students here, I figured, because it's always easy to have like 3-step guides to things, right? 3 is a nice round number. I wanted to go through sort of the general process that I used to link self-control with victimization, but other important theorists, to my mind, have used basically a similar process of reasoning here. How many of you guys have read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions? None of the students? Oh my God. Okay, this is one of those books that really, if you want to do theory and understand kind of like, how scientific revolutions happen, this is the book that you really got to read. And it was assigned in my social theory course at Arizona, and that was how I got acquainted with it. And it's a difficult read. I'm sorry about that, because the examples focus on the physical sciences, and so unless you know about chemistry or have deep knowledge of astronomy or physics or things like that, the examples are kind of like difficult to relate to. That was why what helped me as far as like understanding Kuhn was reading Carl Sagan's Cosmos, Bronowski's Ascent of Man, where they actually fleshed out the kind of like more in a concrete human way how scientific revolutions happened. But I can try to condense a difficult book into 3 steps here for you guys. Step 1, identify an empirical anomaly. This actually goes against a lot of our training, because we are testing hypotheses and we are looking for patterns that support a theory. And I'm going to mention here in a moment here that these anomalies oftentimes are invisible to a lot of the field. But what normally happens here in science is that there's a dominant paradigm. And I'm going to argue here that positivism, or theoretical substantive positivism, is the dominant paradigm here in criminology. All right. These dominant paradigms have logical rules that bind these theories together. So even if the theories emphasize different things like inequality, culture, they all have a similar underlying logic. And so the difference really is one of emphasis. Okay. And so you're going to see not only the similarities across theories, but similarities in terms of like how they approach data collection and methodology and issues of that nature. These dominant paradigms are dominant for a reason. They have a pattern of empirical results. However, these empirical results are misleading. I'm going to use an example from astronomy to give you guys kind of like an idea of this, because maybe you guys are a little bit more removed from this. 600 years ago, the experts in astronomy believed in the geocentric image of the solar system, the Earth-centered, right? That image of the solar system, none of us would subscribe to that today. I think it's fair to say, right? That image of the solar system had, I think, upwards of 4,000 years of observational support. Think about that. In other words, all of the observational data was misleading. All right, it supported that dominant paradigm until Nicholas Copernicus came along and suggested, well, maybe the sun is the center of the solar system. So what is an anomaly? How do you break through the dominant paradigm? An anomaly is a persistent fact that keeps turning up in the research that tends to be, in some ways, it's easy to notice because these anomalies aren't like the aberrant findings that you find in a single study. There is a long history of these anomalies, often decades, sometimes centuries of empirical data showing something that doesn't quite fit with the, what you would expect from the dominant paradigm. Because it doesn't fit, because it's like a misfit toy, it tends to get ignored by the leading figures of that field, all right? Because it doesn't fit, it makes no sense to them. And so, I mean, how do you guys normally respond when you get a result that's contrary to your expectations in your research papers? What do you say? It's boilerplate, what is it? More research is needed.
I just assume I coded the variable wrong.
Yeah, you say, well, it's a false negative or false positive or something like that. And so what ends up happening is you get that aberrant finding, the anomaly gets like one sentence in a paper or a book, and you don't see it again. And occasionally some people will notice it and they'll write commentaries about the anomaly, but oftentimes it gets ignored. Like I said, they're like one finding that doesn't quite seem to fit. And so there's like a tendency because people tend to, it's like, I don't know, ignoring the flaws in your romantic partner, right? You just kind of like focus on the positives, and people do the same thing with theory. Another thing too that's important is to know is that not all things that we think are anomalies are necessarily anomalies. In other words, you give it sufficient attention and from concentrated levels of attention, and maybe the anomaly submits to statistical analysis and it makes sense and everything is fine again. Anomalies, properly speaking, don't operate that way. They absolutely cannot resolve the anomaly. And so what happens is over time, as Kuhn tells us, there's crisis. And I've talked to a number of you guys here, and it seems like we're all in agreement here that there's like a crisis in theory and criminology right now, right? That we haven't seen new theoretical developments. We see a lot of atheoretical, superficial research that's being published. And what theories are coming out there tend to be not very influential. And what you see here is like a metastasizing complexity, but with little additional explanatory power. The classic example being general string theory, which has become like a monstrosity with, I don't know, 100+ variables and a laundry list of disconnected hypotheses. Also, too, you see a reviving of old perspectives, duplicative theory in research, as people kind of like go back into the past to try to see maybe an idea that fell out of favor, perhaps can maybe help resolve the anomaly. You also see a breakdown of interest in theories, a pervasive feeling of nothing new under the sun, right, the students, and no obvious direction forward. All we can do is, I think, or at least my impression was when I was a graduate student was, we can fight over the scraps. Since Wayne took all the glory, Rich and all the others, we're just fighting for pocket change that fell into the couch cushions or something. So I'm going to talk about today's anomaly first before I talk about the other two steps in doing theory. So the victim-offender overlap is an anomaly, in my opinion. Theorists don't talk about it. It is one of those things that that just seem to escape the attention of people who research crime. And so let me quickly run through the history of this for you guys so you can see the nature of the anomaly, how far back it goes. Back in the 1940s, Hans von Hentig, who created the first victim typology, recognized that there was such a person as an offender victim. It was one of the, I think he had like 9 different classes of victims, if I remember right. But it was just like one class among many. The assumption among criminological researchers at this time was, if you read through their work, there was an assumption here that more often than not, offenders and victims were different from each other. You can see this in Mertonian string theory, for example, where people are pursuing the American dream. And so to do that, you need money, right? And so that's the nature of crime, is the acquisition of wealth, status, that kind of thing. So who would you victimize? What logically follows? The wealthy, right? So these were distinct populations, and criminal offenders were the focus of theory, research, and prevention policy. Fairly understandable. victims, actually, if anything, in these theories, the belief was that motivation was sufficient to provide opportunity. If you had the motivation, you would work out the opportunity on your own, and you didn't need help from anybody. In 1958, Marvin Wolfgang, in an analysis of homicide data in Philadelphia, discovered the victim-offender overlap. And this fact, the caused, I don't know that it actually caused any kind of ripple at all, actually, in criminology and sociology. Marvin Wolfgang himself, as far as I can tell from his students and the work that they did going into the 1980s, there was a belief that the victim-offender overlap was confined to the urban poor in Philadelphia. It was not believed to be like a general property that you could find around the world. However, as time went on, by the early 1980s, David Luckenbill was analyzing data on offender and target interactions, and what he found was that victims often played a significant role in the homicide incidents that happened. So there was like offenders were reacting to target behavior and vice versa, okay, implying a causal role for targets that did not exist in crime theory at this time. There was evidence that from Thornberry and Filio's work in the 1970s that victim-offender similarity irrespective of crime type. Hendelang, in his work with the NCBS, found evidence of similarity across all demographic variables. Okay, so what you're seeing here is like a steady progress here of recognition of an anomaly. You start to see the first important theories of the nature of vulnerability to victimization, routine activity theory, lifestyles theory. You see the first speculation about the role of crim theory as an explanation for victimization. Michael Hendelang in 1976 suggested that crim theory could be extended to account for victimization. It was even remarked on by Gary Jensen in his review of Hendelang's book. All right, nobody did anything with it. You see the first evidence that the overlap is found everywhere researchers cared to look with Gottfredson's study of British crime survey data. By the 1990s, thanks to Janet Lauritsen, there's evidence that victimization and offending shared identical substantive correlates. In other words, the things that we think predict crime also predict victimization, social bonds, delinquent peers. And then you see the first theories of crime target decision-making built around the overlap and the shared correlates. So that was my work. Since then, we've seen some encouraging progress. At least, there's at least some level of mainstream respectability doing research on victims. Yet, criminological theory and prevention policy remain overwhelmingly, with few exceptions, fixated on the offender. Virtually all theories, except for self-control theory, pretty much. That's it. None of the other theories, to my knowledge, assign any kind of causal role to victims. That's something we'll talk about here, well, in just a moment. Okay. You will see sometimes surface acknowledgement of the target's role in crime. I see this when I read papers, some of the more recent papers here, and there'll be like an acknowledgement of it, but there's little interest in developing it. And that was what led to the ideas paper that we're going to talk about today. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk about how we get to resolve these anomalies. How do we solve them? So anomalies occur because paradigms create what's called forced perspective. Are you guys familiar with that term in cinematography and photography or art, forced perspective? What is it? Well, you guys are familiar with it, but nobody knows. It's kind of like, yeah.
It's where you determine how the camera, how the audience perspective creates an image that is actually not. So like, for example, that, that structure could be very wide.
Yes. All you know from that is that there's something there and it's not natural. It's a mystery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or it can be very small and the perspective makes it
right
enormous.
Yeah, it's perspective, right? What paradigms do is they create forced perspective. And so they create sort of like habitual ways of dealing with problems and all that. And so in a way, it's, imagine applying a group-based trajectory model to this picture below. Would it bring clarity to it? That's not how anomalies work, okay? How about this? The secret sauce to doing theory is once you've identified an anomaly, change perspective. You don't beat it to death with statistical analysis, or you could. I mean, you could try, and it's legitimate to do so, but shifting perspective. And so we're going to talk about like exactly how you do it.
Orthogonal rotation.
Yeah, now you should think about it here. So shifting perspective. The victim offender overlap has not been the only anomaly that we've encountered in criminology through the years. Wayne, when you did your paper in ASR, you shifted perspective from victim to offender, right?
Yeah, right the other way.
Yeah, you just flipped it around the other way.
Yeah.
Edwin Sutherland famously, shifted disciplines. So, the prevailing explanations of crime in the 1930s and previously were psychological and biological in nature. So he created a sociological perspective. So it's a disciplinary shift. Looking at the age crime curve, which is probably the one that most of you guys are familiar with when it comes to anomalies, the 1983 paper by Hershey and Gofferson basically was saying, we have an anomaly. And here are the implications of this anomaly. In other words, normal science cannot beat this anomaly to death. We have to acknowledge it and try to account for it. Their approach to it was to make distinctions between crime as an act with, preconditions versus stable criminality. Okay. Sampson and Lau took a different approach where they shifted their perspective from a static approach to understanding crime causation to a dynamic approach. So there are any number of ways that you can shift perspective here. Today, I'm focusing on shifting from offender to target. Okay, that's where I'm taking like criminological theories and insights and then trying to understand them from the perspective of target behavior. So what we're going to do is, in doing this exercise, we're going to start with one set of assumptions about human nature. Really, this is kind of like the sort of question I'm asking myself when I'm faced with anomalies is like, how would Jeremy Bentham or Cesare Beccaria explain the victim offender overlap and shared correlates? Okay. And then, once I have a solution here, I shift over to a different set of assumptions. How might Edwin Sutherland, with his sets of assumptions, explain the same phenomenon? Okay. What this process should do, if we're doing it right, is it'll produce competing hypotheses here. All right. It also will explain why the anomaly was invisible previously. Step 3, once you have shifted perspective and you started working through kind of like what these assumptions mean, I think a lot of people who do theory now are focused on variables. They tend to see theories as lists of variables. Actually, if you really want to make a major contribution to theory, what you want to do is you want to focus on new concepts. A concept is a word that you give to a phenomenon that was formerly invisible to scientists. By naming something, you make it real to others. There are many examples in criminology that probably you're all familiar with, but didn't exist at some point previous to the invention of these concepts, like situation, specialization, continuity, change, transitions, turning points. All of those concepts, why they were so effective was they forced other theories, because they cut across all theories, they forced them to take competing positions, generating interest in trying to resolve, kind of like these competing hypotheses. And these concepts fundamentally change your research questions. What are you going to focus on? What's important for understanding the cause of crime? They change research design. And also, too, in the end, they change policy. As I said, the new concepts that I'm introducing here are victimization and vulnerability. These concepts have implications for the research questions that we're asking, the agenda that we're pursuing, also research design, and then finally, policy, because as I suggested at the very beginning, it questions the wisdom of letting the police and the courts have the principal role in crime prevention. Then what happens is you get a paradigm shift, hopefully, a revolution when, once you become familiar with these concepts and you come to accept them and they start to become second nature, you can't go back. You can't ever look at theory and previous research the same way again. So the application. All right. So as I was saying here, I'm following the definitions of particular paradigms as given by Hershey and Dobson in a 1990 paper called Substantive Positivism and the Idea of Crime, and a book by Bob Rogier, the first part of which was a history of criminological thought. All right, so I want you guys to understand here that we can't look at theories as simply lists of variables that you're just simply adding to and creating more complicated regression models here. Theories are logical systems. And if you treat theories as logical systems, whenever you create or you encounter anomalies, you apply a logic to that anomaly, and oftentimes it'll suggest multiple pathways forward here. So I'm going to talk about the assumptions of these models so that you can get familiar with them a little bit. Probably it's going to be familiar to all of you guys here. But the logical system, the advantage of treating it as a logical system is that when you encounter a new fact, you can extrapolate now. Okay. In other words, see beyond knowledge and actually create new hypotheses that people can test. These rules, by the way, also create logical traps, because whatever you say about the offender has to be true about the victim now, and you can't deviate. And we'll talk about that in just a moment here. But positivism, this is the training that most of you guys get. There is no assumption about human nature in positivist theories. In other words, crime is a result of positive causes, socialization, or some other reason. In other words, we're assuming that people are blank slates. All right. Discrete human behaviors like crime require positive causes over which you have no control. A specific combination of prior causes or prior antecedents cause specific behaviors. So in other words, you start to see theories of violence among African Americans, disadvantaged. You start to see theories of white collar crime. So you see differentiation in causes with this. And then criminals being measurably different from non-criminals, like say victims. Choice, on the other hand, assumes that human action, not just crime, arises from a calculation of pleasure and pain. So anything that's advantageous, people will pursue it unless they're stopped. Crime could be one of them. Anything could be, okay? And then people, we can assume, will avoid pain unless prevented. So this is all familiar, I'm hoping, right? Great. So here's the ground rule for this little exercise for us. Because offenders and victims are both human, any assumption you make for one has to apply equally to the other. You cannot have a set of assumptions for the offender and then say, go to the victim and say, I don't like this, and go, you can't do that. Whatever you make true for one has to be true for the other.
Why?
Because we're both human. Unless we're talking about another species of human. It's the nature of human nature, right? Humans, as long as,
The page prior, blank slate.
yeah, blank slate versus choice. So when it comes to the blank slate here, remember that everything is acquired externally. All right, you have to keep that in mind. Nothing is innate or inherent to us. So this should be a softball question for you guys. What is crime according to a positivist then? Or a sociological positivist? How would they define it? What is the boilerplate definition of crime?
Violation of law.
Yeah.
Yes.
Illegal
Let's
behavior.
define
It's whatever's illegal, right? So that is the definition of crime. How about this one? Does right and wrong vary between, I can't English apparently on this slide. Does right and wrong vary between individuals and groups? Obviously, yes, right? Is the meaning of crime relative, or does crime have objective qualities to it? It's relative.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to do the same thing now for victimization. Okay, so that was a warm-up question for trying to figure out what on earth victimization even is. Okay, so how about this? If we are using the same set of assumptions that we just used to explain what crime is, what is victimization? Is what?
Victimhood.
I'm sorry?
Victimhood. Instead of being a victim.
Well, the thing is like, what is it exactly? What is it? I mean, how would you define it? What definition could you come up with if we don't have any assumptions of human nature? We're talking about blank slates here. How about this one? Let me ask you guys this. Maybe this will help sort of like lead into it. Does victimization have a variable or fixed meaning?
It can be variable.
Absolutely.
It'd have to be variable because it's caused, right? And so your understanding of victimization reflects exposure to those causes. And so that means from one person to the next, one group to the next, one society to the next, one time period to the next, everybody's going to define victimization differently. It's so in other words here, can we assume that victimization will have a fixed constellation of effects here? You can't under that because victimization can be literally anything according to positivism. So here are my answers. And the ideas paper kind of like goes into all of these here. In other words, victimization like crime, if we were to extend the logic here, has to reflect normative conflict just as much as crime does. Okay, there can't be any consensus of what victimization even is. How one even reacts to victimization has to be caused by some positive antecedent. Otherwise, the person will not react to victimization. They will not even recognize it as victimization or name it so. And then also too, victimization not automatically damaging to social engagement or social structures and institutions. You might hear about in some works like say Elijah Anderson's as confined to loss of status or something like that. But very rarely will people think about kind of like, well, victimization sucks because I might die or something like that. I think even Sutherland at one point said that self-preservation is ethnocentric. How about this one? In positivism, is self-preservation and resistance to crime instinctual or acquired? Has to be acquired. Has to be acquired. Okay. So you learn to preserve yourself. And so the implications of this is you cannot. If victimization has no meaning, there's no automatic connection to self-preservation. Self-preservation and resistance are motivations. And just like with crime, you have to learn these motivations. Okay? They have to be acquired or they're not present. You're not going to do anything. And so what this means is none of us have any natural defenses against crime. It would not occur to you to run away. It would not occur to you to avoid people. It would not occur to you to put your stuff away or hide your valuables or lock your doors or anything like that. So you guys kind of like see what I'm doing here is I'm starting with a logical premise and I'm trying to answer questions about the nature of victimization and what it means. In fact, the way that you would see victimization depicted in positivist criminology is the interactions of offenders and targets is scripted. And this is from Eric Balmer's paper about something that Elijah Anderson was talking about here with respect to robbery. The code of the street may provide the victim with background knowledge of how to get robbed. It may even allow him or her the presence of mind to assist the assailant in the task. It's just a script. Okay. But what about this for assault, however? Very different script. People feel constrained to not only stand up and at least attempt to resist during assault, but also to pay back and seek revenge afterwards, potentially with lethal force. The implication of this is that it does not matter what the target does or doesn't do, the offender is going to act anyway. Okay. That's the only choice, I guess, if you can even call it that, since we're talking about scripts here, is whether you're going to follow the script or not. Okay. So do you guys think that positivist theories allow targets any ability to alter offender behavior, or must we all just sort of like passively suffer? It's like walking down the street and it's like, somebody comes up to rob you and it's like no different than paying a toll on the highway.
What about the fight or flight?
That would be instinctual, right? Or learned if you were being
That's what
positive.
I'm saying, because it's supposed to be instinctual. If you that right?
Yeah, that's the problem. It's like, if we
so-
assume that it's instinctual, then suddenly we have to go back and change the offender and say that now the offender has a fight or flight mechanism and they're pain avoidant, and now offenders start to look very rational, right? That's the logical trap. It's like, once you start saying, well, these are pretty ridiculous when it comes to victims, it doesn't conform to anything that we expect or know. You start applying it to the offender, you could come up with a very different theory. Now for Sutherland, for example, you have to add a 10th and maybe 11th proposition to his theory to make it work. So there's no a priori assumption here that crime targets have any desire or ability to counter offenders, therefore no urgency to include them in crim theory because they don't matter. Okay, they're just simply following a script. Target precautions, if they work as intended, operate as restraints, like social bonds in a legal code. Allowing the possibility of restraints opens the door to questioning the emphasis of theory and positive antecedent causes. If the victim matters, if I can run away and stop the offender from committing crime, I've introduced a restraint, okay, that you now have to add to your theory of crime. So you can't do that, otherwise you completely undermine the what the theory is arguing. What about choice theories? And crap, I'm going to run out of time, aren't I? So what I want to do is I wanted to kind of like go to probably the theory part of it, where I'm actually introducing a new theoretical model here for you guys, and it reflects choice ideas. The last few minutes here. So when we think about understanding vulnerability and answering the question of why some offenders select some targets and not others, I want you to remember here that offenders and victims are both acting according to their interests. They're both seeking advantage and trying to avoid pain. So automatically, targets are going to, if possible, if they know a crime is going to happen, they're going to make a decision to protect themselves or mitigate or manage the risk somehow, fight or flight, or they avoid the area or something of that nature. So what you're going to see here is that criminal offenders, because they are pain avoidant, they're not martyrs. What that means is it's actually very easy to deter criminals from crime if you're the target by taking precautions. All right. So vulnerability then is anything about the victim or the setting that from a quick glance makes the task of committing a crime rewarding and easy enough and attractively risk-free. Why do targets then do that kind of thing? Why would they do something that would make them vulnerable? That was the question I wrestled with as a second semester graduate student. And so why do they act and fail, or why do they act or fail to act to manage their vulnerability? We can assume that nobody wants victimization because victimization is pain. All right. Decision-making is problematic. And the problem is that there are many things that are advantageous, that feel good, that bring vulnerability with it. So actions that create vulnerability, like going to parties, drinking, using drugs, they're gratifying, but they also produce vulnerability to crime. Okay. So what we're dealing with here is that's just like one example of competing notions of self-interest. I talked about, like, you guys have to go to work, and if you go to work, you leave your home vulnerable. So we have to make choices here. Something else too that we have to bear in mind is that oftentimes, because offenders find it convenient to conceal their motives, usually, the risk of victimization usually is not immediately obvious. And so if you feel safe, you're not going to be inclined to do anything. We'll talk about that again here in just a moment. Also, too, people delude themselves that they can manage the offender, and precautions often entail cost, effort, sacrifice about some event that may or may not happen. So our probability of taking precautions is a function of, I borrowed this from deterrence theory, actually. Very easy to understand, right? The more certain you are that you're going to be a victim of a crime, the more likely you are to feel motivated to do something about it, to take some kind of action. Related to that, the more certain you are that the precaution will be effective, the more likely you are to pursue it. This is why in the literature we find that fear of crime, perceived risk of victimization are connected to people being more likely to take some kind of precaution. Also, too, affecting your decision to take a precaution is the ease or simplicity of those precautions. Precautions that cost money, that are a hassle to set up and deal with, are going to be less attractive to a person, certainly if they don't see a risk of victimization happening anytime soon, than those precautions that are easy and cheap. That's why locking doors is far more prevalent than buying a handgun. Do you guys have guns, just out of curiosity? Low self-control, right?
No, I was in the military.
Oh, yeah. Also, too, our probability of taking precautions is a function of the severity of victimization. In other words, we guard the things that we treasure. Those things that matter to you, you will protect. So if you don't care about your car getting broken into, you may feel no motivation to lock the door. On the other hand, if you do care, probably you are going to lock that door. And also too, certain precautions actually are fun and gratifying. Think about guns, for instance. Guns are awesome in that regard, right? Because you can take a picture of it and your neighbors will admire you for having. Nobody here would have a gun.
No, we did.
Right? Nobody would have suspected.
Your office if you're in the military.
Yeah. But that's the thing is like, I can't brag to my friends about this, about getting a Ring doorbell, but a gun on the other hand is totally different. So there are certain kinds of precautions here that are sort of like inherently fun and interesting, and so those are going to appear more attractive than those that are kind of like boring. So self-control, this ties into the work that I did, and self-control is the tendency to prioritize actions that produce immediate and easy pleasure and ignore long-term risks. So when we think about a person with low self-control, they too care about victimization. They do not want to become victims, and they will take action accordingly. However, what we can expect to see is that a person with low self-control likely is going to continue pursuing some gratifying course of action, like say drinking or being an asshole or something like that. And even if it creates vulnerability, they will pursue it because they perceive it as gratifying. Okay. They also too are likely to negate precautions that they do take by engaging in other forms of risky behavior. Derek and I were talking about this over breakfast here, where, for instance, a precautionary behavior is just being polite to other people, right? Because most of us don't like being attacked. So you're polite to them, you're not rude to them, but you can completely negate being conciliatory by swearing at them. And like, let's say you apologize to them, right? How do your friends sometimes react to an apology? They might still be grousing a little bit. And so you say like, look, you idiot, I apologize to you. Why aren't you respecting that? And you completely negate the benefits of it. That's low self-control. You're also, if you have low self-control, more likely to favor precautions that provide immediate benefits that are easy and simple and that are inherently rewarding. And what that means is that you're more likely to prefer weapons and less likely to see the point of other precautions. Guns and rifles and shotguns sound freaking awesome if you're incapable of perceiving risk. What is there to lose? What could possibly go wrong? So implications and conclusions, and we have probably 2 minutes for questions. The implications of victimization and vulnerability applies to all theories, as I was saying. Starting with the underlying assumptions of the theory, you can derive from those theories what victimization means and the importance of the target and why some people are vulnerable than others. The ideas paper goes into this in probably excruciating detail, but you can see kind of like I can send you the slides and that might help too. But there are implications for all theories is the point that I'm trying to make here, and they represent an opportunity to extend them, an opportunity to possibly winnow down the number of theories that we have out there. Also, too, these concepts present opportunity for new research and policy, new data collection needed. In other words, what we need is data that can match an actor, a potential offender, with their potential and actual targets. Network data, essentially, but a new kind of network data. Also, too, if you're doing qualitative research, you can do qualitative research by getting an all-around perspective from not only the people who break the law, but also their potential and actual targets. Okay, so all of them might be talking about the same incident and giving kind of like their understanding and impressions about, why did they act this way and why did they do that? Okay, so you can see kind of like, the offender's perspective when they actually fail, or maybe what the target was thinking when they were victimized. Okay. Also, too, it gives a new life to those of you who are interested in disadvantage and inequality, because now, rather than focusing on crime, what about access to precautions? I mean, can somebody in a disadvantaged neighborhood buy a Ring alarm? Does that make even sense to them? And so it may be that they're less capable of protecting themselves at the individual level. The ability of precautions for those guys who are interested in life course research probably is age graded. As a young person, your ability to fight or flee situations probably is very much circumscribed because you're tied to the house, whereas adults, on the other hand, are much more free to move. So that's one other possibility in terms of like new research and policy. And as I said, it provides alternatives to the criminal legal system. Now, if we can help people to make better decisions and give them access to precautions that they actually want to use and that would work, then you have less need for an abusive police force or a questionable court system. So. And I am terribly sorry about the running up to the very last minute here.
That's fine, we have time we still have people in the room.
Yeah.
We haven't gone anywhere.
Yeah, Chris, I wanted to start, we have Rich in the room as well, right, that does victimization, and there's this debate out there, right, about victim blaming. And if you tell the victim they have to take measures to protect themselves, are you then blaming them in some way when they are, the victim of an assault or something? So I guess that's something you have to address when you're doing this type of research. I just wondered your approach to that.
Yeah, so like I said, my view is that
Can you turn on your camera so that on your, you should have a camera.
oh wait, yeah, I see.
On. So down, stop there,
and then
on the little right, yeah,
All right.
and then, whoops.
It must be this.
I show you. Well,
Can they hear him?
Can
Can they
you turn
hear
on your video?
Well, there's still 14 people here, so I guess they
Yeah.
can.
Can they hear his response? I don't want to do.
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
With futzing with the technology.
Yeah, sorry about that, people. I mean, I'm dressed up nicely. Just imagine me. So going back to your question here about victim blaming, like I said, my view of it is that under no circumstances is anybody ever entitled to take advantage of somebody in a moment of vulnerability. It's as simple as that. It's unequivocal. But it's like, with, for instance, COVID, if you want to stay healthy, you had to wear a mask, or you had to wash your hands. And, and some people, I guess, I don't know, it's like almost a similar kind of argument for victim blaming there, right? Where it's like, why should I have to do that? I should be able to live freedom, America, right? Or for that matter, like wearing seatbelts in the car. Some people might question that, and say that, it's infringing on my liberties or something like that. But we do it, to protect ourselves, because we recognize that sometimes accidents are not under our control. We don't choose usually to hit other cars. It happens. And so we have to protect ourselves that way. Yeah. Yep, Jeff.
Just a comment in terms of the, because this was partly about creating theories.
Yeah.
And following the assumptions of theories. And an alternative, but so you kind of set up some really strict versions of, say, positive,
yes,
sociological or positive, which I don't know a single sociologist that would agree with any of those.
Yeah,
fully.
Well, let me explain that first of all, because
and-
that was a choice, mainly because I wanted to provide a clear contrast. Like if you follow those logical rules, and I agree with you that there are sociologists who have different sets of assumptions, like Marxist theory, for instance.
Well, let me, because it'll get to victimization. So, I mean, psychology, same thing, nobody believes it's nature versus nurture anymore. Or most people don't. It's not choice versus constraint. They mutually constitute each other, in fact. There is agency and choice, I mean, that's where the field of that, as far as I know, sociology and psychology and even biosocial theories are. The nature via nurture statement comes actually from Richard Lewontin, who's a biosocial theorist.
I was talking to Daryl last night.
Yeah.
He said, he's in favor of choice.
Yeah, obviously. So, I mean, that's not, so when you start with kind of a straw person version, with paradigms, you end up with false dichotomies in terms of the substantive topic. So so either victims are passive recipients of social forces they can't control, or they have choice and agency, but not both. And I think that's misleading. That leads you down some, instead it would be better to see it as dialectic. It's, they're mutually.
So I do have a response to that. one of them is that there isn't any serious dispute that the social sciences began that way.
But they're not there now.
They're not there now, right? So that means that, we do have opportunities to kind of like, look at those assumptions of those theories as they are and then develop them accordingly. I deliberately chose this contrast. I knew, that was going to be like a response. I deliberately chose this because it provides a very clear distinction, just to show kind of like proof of concept that if you follow the logic, you can get sometimes very different predictions. Now we're getting into kind of like fine-grained comparisons,
Yeah.
and that is perfectly legitimate. And I would love to see where people taking those assumptions that you talk about from those different perspectives and what they can do with it. But this goes to the other point, is that it hasn't happened. I like I said, my theory is monopolized theory and prime target decision making. And I'm not saying that, to brag about it or anything like that. I don't like it. I want to see other people, competing theories. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll shut up.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to touch on the example you said about when everyone comes to the meeting or you leave your house vulnerable. Wouldn't, if someone did break in, then wouldn't it be better to be out of the home and potentially jeopardize yourself if you were in that situation?
So Scott Decker and Richard Wright did a study of burglaries and their preference overwhelmingly was not to go into an occupied house. So burglars, just like other criminals, generally want to choose like path of least resistance. They don't want to go into a situation where they're likely to be opposed, because if you're there, right, there's a chance that you can kill them. So like I said, offenders are not martyrs. Other questions? Jeff, did you want to follow up here?
No, I let other people talk.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, about how you said, so I guess, are you considering like the opportunity-based lifestyle theory is sort of separate from that, like most of the theory that you're talking about, like?
Yes.
Repeat the question for the people.
Oh,
who
all
are
right.
on
So
Zoom.
am I considering lifestyle theory as something separate from?
Well, yeah, you're just saying that most crime theories like don't focus on the victim, but I would say the theories that do focus on the victim most are opportunity and lifestyle theories. They don't always necessarily hypothesize, sort of choices, I guess, but it's more the theory is based on the victim.
Yeah.
So are you considering that like a different area of theory?
I see life course, or so life Freudian slip. I see lifestyles theory and routine activity theory as being theories about the nature of vulnerability. In other words, what constitutes a vulnerable situation, constitutes a risky situation. It's not a theory of decision making. It's a choice theory, however, so it's perfectly compatible with what I'm talking about here. And that's the reason why a lot of research looking at self-control and victimization has like measures of risky activities and lifestyles and all of that, included in the models. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. I was just gonna sort of branches off of what Jeff was saying. A lot of what I understand from choice theory or decision making is looking at the origins of preferences and perceptions, which end up being your definition positive.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question. It's
I guess that's where it sort of breaks down.
it's like economic behaviorism. Is that what you're?
Yeah. So it's like, where do preferences come from? Because you have to have a model of that in order to understand decision making. And so where do perceptions and where do preferences come from in order to understand decision making, which then puts it into the domain of sociology. And so there's actually this convergence that's happening between microeconomics and subjective sociological explanations, and you're ending up in the same place. It's like they're learned. Your perceptions are structured by your context.
Sure.
Which is also true of Hershey and Gomerson's definition of impulsivity. It is a social phenomenon, even though I disagree with that.
I know, because the other way of looking at it almost is that many of the things that we think of as being like our choices and preferences are shaped by the situations we find ourselves in, right? And I mean, but it represents an interesting next step for this, where, how do choices and preferences come about that are relevant to, why we protect ourselves and how we do it, right? It was like what we were talking about over breakfast, like with weapons and guns.
We talk about culture. We talk
Yes,
about
absolutely, culture.
attitudes. Yeah, it's hard to then not address or to bring in some of the classics.
Yeah, so I did a paper where it turns out that culture doesn't affect your tendency to want to protect yourself. It absolutely determines what you do to protect yourself. Guns as opposed to non-guns.
Which is a preference.
Yes, absolutely. So there is a place for sociology.
Another question.
You win.
Okay. So my question is, how would your theory, your ideas maybe apply differently to victimization by a stranger or acquaintance versus victimization by, like domestic violence or a person, someone you're
question.
involved with? How would that theory differ maybe?
So the when I talked about like what victimization was, it was on one of the slides here, but it was defined from the choice perspective and the assumptions of choice theory is defined as all pain. It's not consented to, so you don't benefit from it, you don't volunteer for it or anything like that. And it's associated with trauma, it violates your right to your body and all of that. And that even if in your mind you don't use the word victimization to describe that incident, you are, to the degree that you have freedom to do so, going to do what you can to manage the risk and try to avoid being attacked. And it may be that, like in an intimate partner situation, your choices are very limited. But even then, in the literature, as far as I understand it, like women who are attacked will try to be conciliatory more to calm the other person down, and that's a precautionary act, right? So it's the same thing, like even with children, right? Children feel like they're going to be attacked, spanked for something like that. What do they do naturally? Hide in the closet or under the bed or something of that kind, right? So, they try to manage it or mitigate it. Even if they don't think of it as I'm being attacked, they emotionally respond to it the same way.
So it's kind of along the same lines, but I was thinking how I think Rich brought it up earlier, like, there's a lot of similarities, like between like victims and offenders and everything, but like if you were to theorize like just like how would you kind of create, or would you use the same kind of approach to creating theories to predict victimization without it being like, like the victim only category? Like, would you use the same?
So Wayne and I did a paper some time ago where we tried to answer that question. So we treated victimization and offending as basically like specialization. Some people specialize in one role, some people specialize in another role, and then you have like the overlap or, in the distribution. And the frustrating thing was that from one model to another, the predictors changed. It was very frustrating because, the predictors that did turn up, we couldn't, or at least I couldn't, maybe Wayne can't, I couldn't account for them theoretically in a convincing kind of way. And that's kind of like the problem, is that the predictors change from one paper to another or one model to another. What does it mean? It's probably noise. That's the thing, is like you need like something that you can hang your hat on, so to speak, empirically. Questions? Yeah,
Another question. I guess this is I always struggle with this, is at what point is there a new theory versus an older concept or idea applied to a new topic? So in other words, you're looking at rational choice and impulsivity as an explanation for victimization, if I understand correctly.
Or at least vulnerability.
Okay.
Yeah.
But isn't that really the rational choice that the key as well as impulsivity?
I think the issue here is that like it's never really, or it needs to be something just developed. Remember, like one of the things of the jobs of the theorist is to make the implicit explicit. All theories actually, to some degree, have something to say about victims and the nature of vulnerability. They represent opportunities to flesh them out, and people don't have to agree with me about it, but there may be pathways I haven't considered. I could be wrong. You
I
know,
guess is your application to victimization as a new dependent variable for an existing theory.
right?
And I struggle with this, like, where is a new theory different from what the existing ideas are?
So if I'm understanding what you're, so, like I was saying here when I got to the implications, we don't really have a whole lot of research looking at, assessing, except for like some of the stuff that Rich has done, and a few others, really the role, the importance of the target in connection with, the things that we think cause crime. And in that sense, ideas of victimization and vulnerability mean that these models are misspecified. In other words, we're leaving out a pretty huge component potentially of why crime happens. And if that's so, you can make a pretty powerful argument that, if we address this matter in some way with new policy to give people choices, all that, we can substantially reduce the crime problem without the need of the criminal legal system. Which, I don't know, that's, Jeff, we were talking about this, right? And one thing I would imagine people who study the system can agree on is that the system is extremely resistant to reform. It's and so at some point, it's like, being in a relationship with somebody, you just finally got to give up on them. It's like the hell with this.
I think we should probably call, we're 15 minutes over unless there's any urgent questions.
I'd like to share a quote to close it out.
Okay.
So on the Zooropa album, U2 has a song called Stay, and it has the line, "You're a vampire or a victim, depends on who's around." So there we
Very
go.
good. Very good. Yes.
Sorry, I missed the first part, but I was curious if you had an example. So forget about how we call it new theory or new application. Like, how would you, if you give an example about a new hypothesis, a new angle that we would use it to apply?
Yeah, so when we think
I'm
about,
sure I missed some.
yeah, so like for instance, is there does the meaning of victimization change from individuals, groups, societies? That's one hypothesis, or time periods, or based on the context in which victimization happens. That's an empirical question. Do the effects of victimization vary, such as like the trauma, emotional damage, all of that? Does that change from one group to another based on how they perceive victimization? Right. For instance, maybe back in the time when wife beating was legal, maybe women were accepting of it and they just didn't do anything and they didn't feel traumatized as a result or experience psychological damage. So there are questions that you can ask like that to see kind of like, that are connected to kind of like how we define what victimization even is. Or is it just like, everywhere in the world, if you get punched in the mouth, nobody likes it.
Right, and if framing things this way, you do allow for the importance of context, the culture, to be different perception.
Yeah, so that's just like one of them, but the others have to do with kind of like, well, why are people vulnerable? And they're going to be, why do they make choices to protect themselves or not? And the different theories are going to take different perspectives on this.